On the city's edge stood a mansion, a cold monument to power, home to the untouchable Edward Turner. One quiet morning, a young woman named Grace walked through its iron gates, armed only with her purse, references, and a determined heart. She didn't know that her first day inside the Turner estate would change not just her life, but also the heart of the man who had everything except peace. Edward ruled his world with absolute control. But when Grace, a simple maid, refused to bow to his authority, she shattered his illusion of power with a single, defiant, no. What started as a test of wills between different classes blossomed into a powerful lesson on dignity, respect, and love. This is more than a story about a billionaire and his maid. It is about the courage to stand firm and the strength it takes to change a heart that had forgotten how to love. Stay tuned to discover how it all unfolds. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to follow for more. The first time Grace walked up the long stone driveway leading to the Turner estate, the morning sun had barely risen. The mansion stood before her like a mountain of glass and marble, silent, cold, and flawless, the kind of place that seemed designed to keep people like her out. The iron gates had opened slowly, creaking as though they too doubted she belonged there. She carried only a worn leather purse and a folder containing her references, her shoes slightly dusty from the long trek from the bus stop. She had never ventured this far north of London before. The air smelled different here, cleaner, sharper, tinged with the scent of wealth and pride. Before we continue with the story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone, and leave a comment with your thoughts about today's story. Now let's get back to it. Inside, the housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle, greeted her stiffly, her eyes sweeping Grace from head to toe. She was an older woman with a face like folded parchment and a voice that carried the weight of experience. "You're here for the maid position?" she asked, not as a question, but as a statement. Grace nodded. Her voice often failed her when she was nervous, so she preferred to let her eyes speak for her. Mrs. Doyle led her through the grand hallway, where portraits of stern-faced people lined the walls, Turners, every one of them, staring down like silent judges. At the end of the corridor stood Edward Turner himself, the millionaire everyone in town whispered about. He was in his mid-40s, tall, impeccably dressed, his hair cut with precision that seemed to defy time. He didn't smile when he saw her. In truth, he rarely smiled at anyone. Years of building companies, negotiating deals, and commanding authority had stripped him of softness. Wealth had given him everything except peace. People called him brilliant, but behind closed doors, those who worked under him called him cruel. He looked up from his desk, his blue eyes as cold as winter. "Your name is Grace?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of a man used to being obeyed. "Yes, sir," she said quietly, standing taller. Mrs. Doyle handed him the folder, but he didn't glance at it. Instead, he studied Grace as one might study a painting, detached, curious, searching for flaws. After a long silence, he said, "You know, Grace, I've had many applicants for this position. Most didn't last a week. I need someone who's obedient, someone who follows instructions without hesitation." Grace nodded politely. "I understand, sir." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. "Good. Then let's begin with a simple test." The words lingered in the air like smoke. Grace's stomach tightened. She'd expected to answer questions about cleaning, not to face a test. Edward stood, his tall figure looming over her, his expression unreadable. "Unzip your dress," he said calmly, almost casually, as if he'd asked her to hand him a pen. The room fell utterly silent. Even Mrs. Doyle froze, eyes wide with shock. Grace thought she must have misheard him. "Sir?" she whispered. He looked at her evenly. "You heard me. I want to see if you follow orders." The seconds that followed felt like hours. Grace's heart pounded in her chest. A lump rose in her throat, but she didn't cry. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not a powerful man, but a broken one hiding behind his wealth. Slowly, she shook her head. "No, sir," she said softly yet firmly. "I came here to work, not to be disrespected." Her voice trembled, but her spine stayed straight. Her hands, though shaking, clutched her purse tightly. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Mrs. Doyle lowered her gaze, too afraid to witness what would come next. No one ever said no to Edward Turner. Edward's expression hardened. "You can leave," he said curtly. Grace nodded, turned, and walked toward the door with quiet dignity. She didn't run. She didn't beg. She just walked, one steady step at a time until the heavy door closed behind her. For the rest of that day, Edward couldn't focus. He had fired people for less, humiliated them for sport, and felt nothing. But this time, something gnawed at him. Her words echoed in his mind like a bell that refused to stop ringing. "I came here to work, not to be disrespected." He tried to drown the thought with work, with meetings, with numbers, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, strong, proud, hurt, yet unbroken. That night, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat by the tall windows of his study. Rain tapped gently against the glass. He thought about how easily he could buy anything, cars, houses, even loyalty, but not the kind of strength he had seen in that woman's eyes. It unsettled him. He had always believed people were only as valuable as their usefulness. Grace had shattered that belief with one simple word: no. 3 days later, Edward picked up his phone and called Mrs. Doyle. "Find that girl," he said simply. "Grace, bring her back." Mrs. Doyle hesitated. "Sir, after what happened, I doubt she'll want to return. Just find her," he said, his tone softer than usual. Grace was surprised when the call came. She was staying in a small flat in East London, barely making rent, cleaning tiny apartments for cash. When Mrs. Doyle asked her to return, Grace almost refused. But there was something in the older woman's voice, a flicker of sincerity that stirred her curiosity. When Grace arrived back at the mansion, Edward was waiting in the sitting room. He stood as she entered, something he rarely did for anyone. "Grace," he began awkwardly, "I owe you an apology. What I did was wrong. I wanted to test your obedience, but instead I tested your dignity, and you passed that test in a way I didn't expect." Grace looked at him quietly, unsure if this was another trick. "Why did you call me back, sir?" "Because I want you to work here," he said plainly. "Not because you obeyed, but because you didn't. This house is full of people who fear me. I could use someone who doesn't." There was a long pause before Grace nodded. "All right, sir. I'll work, but on one condition. I expect respect." For the first time, Edward smiled faintly. "You'll have it." From that day forward, the mansion began to change in ways no one could explain. Grace's gentle presence softened the coldness that had once filled the rooms. She greeted everyone, from the gardener to the chef, with kindness and patience. She sang softly while she cleaned, her voice like sunlight slipping through clouds. Even Mrs. Doyle, once stiff and distant, found herself smiling more often. Edward noticed everything. From his office window, he would watch Grace working in the garden, wiping sweat from her brow, pausing to help the gardener with his tools. She never complained. And the more he watched, the more he admired her. Weeks turned into months. One afternoon, as Grace was dusting the library shelves, Edward walked in. "You don't have to clean in here every day," he said. She turned, smiling slightly. "Dust never rests, sir. It always finds a way back," he chuckled. "You're quite philosophical for a maid," Grace shrugged. "Life teaches you things when you don't have much. You start noticing what truly matters." Edward studied her face, the calm confidence in her eyes, and felt something shift within him, something deeply human. For the first time in years, he wanted to listen instead of command. After that, they began to talk more often. About life, about family, about loss. Grace told him about her mother, who had worked 2 jobs to raise her and her younger brother back in Birmingham. Edward, in turn, spoke of his late wife, who had died 5 years earlier in a car accident. It was the first time he had mentioned her since the funeral. Grace listened quietly, her eyes filled not with pity but with compassion. "You blame yourself," she said softly. He looked away. She was driving to meet me. I made her rush. "I can't undo that." Grace placed her hand gently on the table between them. "You can't change the past, sir, but you can choose not to let it ruin the rest of your life." Her words lingered like balm. That night, Edward couldn't sleep, but this time not from guilt but gratitude. The staff began to notice how much their employer had changed. He spoke kindly. He said thank you. The man who once scolded them for fingerprints on glass now asked about their families. Grace's influence had reached corners of his soul he hadn't known existed. But not everyone was pleased. One afternoon, Mrs. Doyle cornered Grace in the hallway. "You've changed him," she said, her tone unreadable. Grace frowned. "I haven't done anything." "Oh, but you have," Mrs. Doyle murmured. "He looks at you differently. Everyone sees it." "Be careful, child. People talk." Grace brushed it off. But that night, as she lay in her small room at the top of the mansion, she couldn't shake the thought. Could it be true? Could Edward feel something for her? She told herself it was impossible. He was rich, powerful, and white. She was just a maid. Yet the way his eyes softened when he looked at her told another story. One rainy evening, Edward asked her to join him for dinner. "It's just the two of us tonight," he said almost shyly. She hesitated, then accepted. The table was beautifully set, candles flickering gently. For a while they ate in silence, the sound of rain filling the gaps between them. Then Edward spoke. "Grace, do you ever think about what people deserve?" She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I used to believe people got what they earned. Money, power, comfort. But lately I've started to think that maybe we just get what we need to learn, to grow." He paused, his voice lower now. "You taught me that." Grace smiled faintly. "Sometimes life sends people our way to remind us who we are." Their eyes met. For a long moment neither spoke. Something unspoken passed between them, tender, real, and frightening. Weeks later, Edward invited her to accompany him to a charity event in London. "I want you there," he said. "Not as staff, as my guest." Grace hesitated. "People will talk, sir." "Let them," he said simply. "They've talked about me my whole life. I'm done caring." That night, when she appeared in a simple navy blue dress, the entire room turned to stare. Edward offered his arm, proud and calm. Whispers followed them, but he didn't care. For the first time, he felt free from his image. On the drive back, Grace looked out the window. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "You could have anyone," he smiled sadly. "Because you're the only one who ever made me want to be a better man." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "I'm still your maid, sir." "Then let me be the one serving you for once," he said softly. Months passed and love blossomed quietly, built not on power, but on mutual respect. Edward's friends called him foolish. Society whispered. But none of it mattered. Grace stood beside him and he beside her. One afternoon he brought her back to the same office where they had first met. The desk, the silence, the memory of that shameful day still lingering. He looked at her, regret and hope in his eyes. "This is where I tested you," he said. "And you changed my life that day." "I don't want that memory to end with shame." Grace smiled gently. "Then let's rewrite it." He stepped closer, nervous like a young man. "Grace, will you marry me?" Her breath caught, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "But promise me one thing. Never forget that it wasn't my obedience that brought us here. It was my refusal." He nodded. "I'll never forget." Their wedding was small, held in the garden she once cleaned. Mrs. Doyle stood beside her, tears in her eyes. Even the gardener grinned wider than ever before. Years later, when people asked Edward Turner what had changed him, he would always reply, "A woman who wouldn't unzip her dress." They'd laugh. Not understanding, but he knew the truth. Grace had taught him that respect is the foundation of love, and that love without respect is just power in disguise. In quiet evenings, when he looked at her sitting beside him, he often thought of that day, the day she said no, and how that single word had saved not just her dignity, but his soul. In the end, the story of Edward and Grace wasn't about wealth or class. It was about the power of standing firm in who you are, even when the world tries to make you small. It was about how one act of courage can change the course of two lives. And somewhere deep inside, Grace always believed that God had brought her to that mansion not to clean it, but to cleanse a heart that had forgotten how to love. What do you think of this story? Leave a comment below. Thanks for watching and God bless.